So the question is, what was Rabbi Wittenberg's relationship with Rabbi Janet Klausner, who leads Reform Judaism, and Chief Rabbi Mervis of the Orthodox community? Because it is obviously a very fragmented community, and I would just add, and Masorti is a very little fragment within that fragmented community.
Yeah, I'm very fond of Rabbi Mervis. I mean, we bump into each other from time to time, always have nice words for each other. I was there at his induction as Chief Rabbi. In terms of actually working together on anything of any significance, that really isn't happening, and the same applies with the Reform movement. And I think we ought to be looking for test projects. You know, one I've thought about with Kinloss would be, can we get together and clean out Dollis Brook? You know, so long as we don't think of it as a mikvah, I don't see a difficult religious dimension there. And you know, if we get stuck in the mud, we can do it together. But I actually think more cooperation is possible, and there are, you know, and I also think that, thank God, there are many doors into the Jewish community, because there are many different people in the Jewish community, and I don't think we're really in competition with each other. I think we're providing slightly different things, and that our strength will be to realise that.
Well, it's obvious the Rabbi Mervis issue, but why is there not cooperation with the Reform movement?
There is, you know, there are friendships. There is some sense, I think, of anxiety about this site, which has made things a bit more difficult. Is it the headquarters of the Reform movement, or is it the site of the New North London Synagogue? And the balance between that has to be kept very, you know, very, very thoughtfully and very carefully and sensitively balanced. But there's a lot more we could and should do together.
Because, can I just come back to you? And I just wondered whether Rabbi Mervis have you found that in the short period of time that he's been Chief Rabbi, that he's been a little bit more prepared to build some of those bridges?
It's early days.
Daniel.
Jonathan, we really enjoy the jokes and stories that we get in your sermons, but clearly there are some you hear which are not suitable for inclusion in sermons. I wondered if you could maybe share one.
We're after the watershed now. There are no kids in.
Mercifully, I have congregants like you with a wonderful sense of humour. I think the answer has to be no.
Shame. I'm trying to see if anyone is actually surprised by that answer. Who else has got something to... Oh, we're turning to ask the rabbi here. Who is... yeah, you've got...
Jonathan, you spoke about the joyously long queue of buggies, but our congregation, like many other communities, seems to have an issue where, as the children get into their teens, we begin to lose them. There is Noam, obviously, but we do lose them from within the regular community. I just wonder if you had any thoughts about that and whether you see it as an issue or not.
For sure it's an issue, and a difficult issue. And what you say is true, we have a strong youth movement. This is an area, you know, perhaps the most urgent area of building. And Noam too has been evolving its philosophy. The role of learning has become much more central in its self-conception, in particular around the conservative yeshiva. This is something I've strongly been supporting. And what we are hoping is that there will be a generation of leaders who have always been people with, with a lot of gifts and charisma, but who also have spent serious time at the conservative yeshiva or similar institutions, and been able to sort of mediate a lot more learning. I've also come to feel, particularly in the last couple of years, that we underpitch our ask around B'nai Mitzvah. And one of the things I'm looking at is it'll simply be part of the contract that when you have a bar mitzvah, within the next year, you read from the Torah or do something equivalent, but not the same again. So that I'm very keen on upping the ask. The other thing I was thinking about, actually came up today in a way, is that I haven't even passed this by Barbara Stone, the whole Cheder system should be premised on the notion your child joins the Cheder and you commit every year or every 2 years as a parent, or in some cases perhaps a grandparent, to a course of study in Judaism on your level. Because one of the big issues is whether children see that they're expected to study Judaism, but their parents don't. And a home is a collaborative effort of engagement in a culture and learning. All of these are things which I want to see happen. I'm also pleased about the notion that as more and more of the children of the Asif group hit that age range, they will push the threshold up because of high levels of commitment. And that's a good thing. Perhaps one's thinking changes stage by stage, but I don't think I would have felt able to say that 3 years ago. But it seems to me the community is a point where this is beginning to happen and has to happen, and these will be the next steps. And I'll be totally for them.
You said that sort of community evolving as a community of communities, and I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about how you see that developing.
What do you think the Jewish community's attitude should be to the question of whether there should be limits on free speech?
I'm trying to think of an appropriate joke with which to answer, but I'm failing, I'm sorry. Community of communities is very much a local question. Life can be thought of as concentric or interrelated circles of which one is a part, with one's family and friends and relatives as a core circle. I think for some people, some of the time, a regrettable core circle. Some of the relatives, but I don't feel that way. And then there's a sense of local community, and then there's a sense of bigger community. With a large synagogue like this, it's very, very important, and it's our responsibility actually to enable people to feel that they can engage, that they can give, and that their gifts of what they have to offer are really valued and appreciated, and that they are known to others in the community. It's very interesting. Because of walking in the West Highlands, we've met these honey makers, beewares, near Dunkeld, and we became friendly with them. And as a result, and that's completely an excuse to get back to Scotland, I suggested that we distribute small pots of honey with the synagogue's blessed logo, another sticky factor, to all our members, which we did. And we also included a Catholic neighbour who said, I'm not Jewish, but that was really very nice, and we could do that again. Then that became a biennial habit. Now people said, well, I didn't know as they delivered them, that I didn't know there was 2 other members of our community in my road. Well, how did we let it happen that they didn't? So actually local groups that would meet for maybe a couple of Friday nights a year, and a Havdalah, and a Sunday morning learning session, so that actually, supposing there were a heavy snowfall, and someone isn't well, it wouldn't have to go through the centre for someone to say, wait a minute, in our circle, who's doing the shopping? Is your heating working? Those are basic things about care and community and belonging that I would like to see established much more widely, and then those communities come together for bigger things. So region is one way of developing it, and life moment is another way of developing it. There's some life stages where we're very strong in what we offer. There are other life stages, and one which Nikki and I are going through, which is with our youngest going to go to university. That's a change. It's a profound and huge and not entirely an easy change. We're scarcely the only ones in the community. Now comes the sense, well, what am I going to make with the fact that there is somewhat more autonomy over time? So there are opportunities and we mustn't miss them. And also I feel if we've got people with things to offer to each other and we're not making that available, well then we're wasting our human resources. Much wider question of freedom of speech. A very interesting conversation I had about this, I don't feel free to name the person actually, I feel like I would need to ask their permission, who was saying that the whole issue with the cartoons has made them revise their views about Holocaust denial and has made them feel that curbing freedom of speech is a very high price for a society to exact. And on the whole, my instinctive position is to be strongly in favour of freedom of speech. If I think about the penalties for telling truths, didn't Rabbi Dr. Louis Jacobs pay a very high penalty for saying the truths he believed in? And I think societies that don't allow people to speak out are oppressive and ultimately tyrannical, and they ultimately prevent those who could have pointed at that tyranny from being able to do so. One of my favourite poets is the Russian Jewish poet, to those Judaism was marginal, Osip Mandelstam. He was twice arrested by Stalin and died in exile somewhere in a transit camp of a heart attack the second time. And he says, "They left me my shoe size in earth with bars around it. What good it do them? I had my lips, and they frame words, even in silence." Now what a waste that they're framed in silence. But they got out in the end. Now, does that mean, and I remember 2008, and I remember saying, and some people strongly disagreed with me, and now I don't know whether they were right or wrong, I didn't think the publication of those cartoons was the most sensitive or thoughtful thing to do. And Judaism, without punishing a person for speaking, is very concerned about the nature of our speech. Lashon hara, people know about. But ona'ah, oppressive or hurtful speech to a person's face in which you punish them for who they are, that is considered a serious offence. And most of the things we talk about on Yom Kippur in that long list of categories of sin are speech sins. So I think there's a balance between freedom and sensitivity. I was thinking particularly about satire. I've never been a lover of satire. It seems to me a sharp and harsh weapon, and we haven't liked it. I don't think Jews are so much concerned with satire against God or against Moses, but it's very easy for us to think about cartoons which the Jewish community, or depictions, Sharon devouring babies, which hit on anti-Semitic tropes that we find deeply offensive. Well, I think on the whole it's a good thing that there are laws about incitement to hatred, and that there is concern about those matters, but the mechanisms then are protest and the law, not violence with regard to free speech. And I also feel that if the legitimacy of satire as a tool is attacked, I think I'm going to side with the satire.
To be hurtful and insulting. If you add another layer on, as just the Charlie Hebdo magazine did by doing them, caricatures and insulting messages, that's another whole thing. But just to draw in human form, the Prophet is experienced as an insult. Now we can think of things that in Judaism, I've tried to think of analogies, and so the best somebody else has come up with so far is to say the Hebrew name of God. And if that was splashed across newspapers, doesn't mean that you don't have to add the next bit of an insult, just using that. What about that? The idea that what is a religious scruple for one community, should that be respected to the point of not being transgressed by other communities?
That was...
It occurs to me that it could make a very interesting behind closed doors conversations with, maybe this is something that rabbis and imams should talk about. Clearly, what has been said about depictions of the Prophet, peace be upon him, is real for Muslims. And when you wrote about it in The Guardian, you said, we're not reprinting those cartoons, not because we're intimidated by Islamist terror, but because we don't want to offend the millions and millions of faithful, honest, true Muslims who will be hurt by this. And needless hurt is an offence. Needless hurt is definitely an offence in Jewish law. But it might make an interesting conversation, I don't know if it's possible to have it, to ask, if this is so, what could a cartoonist say in the medium of a cartoon about Islam that wouldn't be considered blasphemy, but that could make a point? There's the things I think you can say to Jews and other groups, and it might be sensitive to know what they were. But I think the willful transgression of what is sensitive for a whole group is not something we should be engaged in doing. I would hesitate to go, to endorse the position which would sound like, and we're okay about being intimidated into not doing it. Because one's freedoms, one's intimidation seizes hold of one's capacity to express oneself. One's on a road which will only get worse.
Do you have any ideas do you have any sympathy for the Muslim prohibition on graven images because of the Jewish approach to it?
Thank you. And it was Lady.
The Economist had an article on Jews a year or so ago, looking at the community, its fragmentation, assimilation, and it said although a Catholic atheist was a contradiction in terms, a Jewish atheist was not. In fact, the majority of the community in the UK, in the Economist's opinion, were just that. Could you comment?
Yes, I have. I have sympathy in that. I think one's first position towards the rules and attitudes and principles and sensitivities of another faith is to be respectful of them. And within the world of Islam, do I find the concern with images difficult? No. On what grounds? And why should I? I want to say that within Judaism, the history of imagery is much more varied than one thinks. Old synagogues excavated from northern Israel have depictions in mosaic of human form, not just other forms. It's been more or less fluid. It hasn't been as severe as one might see from the works of an Israeli artist like Agam, who avoids even pictorial depiction. There's a history there, and there's times of strictures, and there's times of more liberty. Just on that related question, somebody asked me once, and it came up: would I expect a Christian visiting the synagogue if they wore a cross to take it off? My answer is no. In the same way as I would hope that I wouldn't be asked in visiting a church, and when I haven't been asked to take my kippah off. I welcome people as who they are, on the basis that they're respectful of who I am. And I think that, as it were, insipid interfaith, where we also have to pretend not to be who we are, is weak. And actually really engaging with what each other cares about is what matters, and much more interesting, and has real depth to it. And a lot of people involved in interfaith want their partners to be people who have faith. And that's one of the things I want to say about anti-Semitism. It is incredibly important. It may be, who knows how effective it is, that we do the maximum to reach out, to invite in, to encounter, to debate with people of other faiths. The Wolf Institute has been doing a research recently on how attitudes to other faiths are formed. And I was talking with them, I was asked to be a respondent to their research. And in my view, any religious leader should have to spend at least a fortnight living consistently in a community of a different faith. That we have to be sensitized to what hurts others. And a pulpit, one might have thought a while ago pulpits are fairly feeble, they're irrelevant to our society. Religion has entered the public square in a most often rather unpleasant and violent manner. Pulpits are powerful places. Pulpits often control weaponry, not the other way round. And therefore I don't think anybody should occupy a pulpit who has not spent serious engagement in an interfaith context. And I don't mean a visit. I mean study of text, study of difficult text, and living in the context of our other faith community for a significant time.
I'm just going to say that interfaith work is obviously a response, but probably not quite what you've got in mind, I'm guessing, when you talk about are we doing enough to combat anti-Semitism. So there may be more things than interfaith you want to consider.
I mean, I feel that's the bit that would be my contribution and a rabbinic contribution. I think there's also vigilance, there's also protest, and all of these things are important. But it'd be the piece that I feel I can play a part in, and the community can play a part in, is also reaching out.
Good. Jewish atheists, do you recognise the Economist description that a majority of British Jewry are probably atheists?
I'd say a majority of British Jewry are probably agnostics, rather than atheists. And I found this changing. I've mentioned in the past that 20-something years ago I wanted to do a course on God and Judaism, and the chair of the synagogue then came up to me and said, "Do you think that's a good idea? Is it of interest to people? I suggest you do a course on synagogue architecture instead." This was advice that I declined to take. I find people are really, really interested in God. And that there is a wish, if not to believe, to think about what that might mean for us. However, it's perfect. People come to synagogues for all kinds of reasons. I once asked a group of teenagers to make a list of why they thought the next 25 people were coming in if they were standing at the synagogue door. It made very interesting reading. Mainly they said, children think they're being brought by their parents, parents think they're being brought by their children, and most of them don't want to be in there in the first place. But yes, Jews come to identify as Jews. Even the group who were here just now, the soldiers from Israel, said that for some of them in Israel, you go to a synagogue to pray. In the diaspora, they said it was a revelation to some of them. You also go to identify. It's perfectly legitimate. As far as I'm concerned, I don't feel it's my job to measure where a person comes from when they enter the community. But if a person feels that the community has not taken them anywhere, not emotionally, not spiritually, not intellectually, and they try to engage, that's my fault and our fault. The responsibility is where we go on that journey.
Spirituality. I know how to feel it because sometimes I feel it, but most of the time I don't. How can you teach spirituality? How can you explain to people what spirituality is and how you might come to feel it?
I recognise the lady in this row here. You may have a question for our speaker. Yeah.
You said people are very interested in God. Do you feel responsible for this community's increasing interest in dogs?
Okay, we've got dogs, spirituality, and Israel. Certainly not in that order. So why don't you tell us which of those three you believe in most strongly?
There's a relationship between the word dog and the word God. It's interesting that Mossi's first two words, the first word was dog, and the second word was Amen. And he had the wit to manage the second one when there were quite a lot of people there. So this reflected our house. I often think God is just a word. We were joking. Mossi was a bit embarrassed when his old school decided it was going to put up a list of people who'd got into Oxbridge or medical school. And he was particularly struck that they spelt Corpus Christi College wrong. This is admissible for a Jewish school, but I suggested to him that they'd spelt it C-R-P-U-S, and that this was a mistake. I guess let's make this collective, Nikki. We are responsible for greater level of canine ownership in this community than just about any other in the Jewish world, I would think. Israel and spirituality. I'm going to keep the spirituality one for last. It's extremely important that people, you talk about freedom of speech, that people are able to disagree with the rabbi. It's discourse is plural, and it comes from having different opinions. In a way, the responsibility to the community is how it conducts that discourse. And if people feel that they are so repressed that they can't say what they think, or not allowed to think what they think, then that's wrong. At the same time, and once or twice people have said to me, you should have no opinion on Israel. Or actually, I think that's immoral. I don't think that's morally okay. I think I have no choice but sometimes to give an opinion. And I have no right to say who people should vote for in the elections. I might say that I think people as Jews should not vote for UKIP. I have no right to say which of the major parties they would vote for. That's transgressing.
Why no UKIP voting?
Basic racism, which we have suffered from. And it'll make other forms of racism look legitimate. So yes, I have views about the hope for a two-state solution, and I also try to get to Israel 2-3 times a year at least. I have a love for the country, which I hope comes across, and care about it, and I see the future of the Jewish people, and it's increasingly as bound up with the future of Israel. I was absolutely delighted and pushed for the fact that we had that group of soldiers here, and it's something I'll push for our community to do. I think every second year is probably as much as we can manage, and to deepen our links with Israel in the ways that speak to our own hearts and feelings. I have views on a number of things to do with Israel. I think sometimes I'm duty-bound to express them, but people are not bound to agree, and there needs to be discourse. There needs to be discourse around it, and that applies to other issues as well.
Before you get to spirituality, the last 30 years, has it made you stronger in your connection with Israel or less strong?
I don't know. I mean, as a community rabbi, it's harder to get there for longer.
No, I don't mean that. I mean your feelings about Israel.
No, it's harder to get there for longer, and the time there increases one's strength of. It goes up and down for me. There are times when I feel very sort of cynical and hopeless. There are times when I feel much more engaged. But in the end, it's the human contact. It's the huge numbers of people I know and care about and feel close to that really, that really matter. In terms of teaching spirituality, this is one of the most challenging and difficult questions that one can have. It's also a question that's concerning me as a parent, and I've said this before, but I really don't know where this will go in their lives. But when they were younger, and we used to go to the New Forest, and they didn't sleep at night, used to put them in the car, drive to the middle of nowhere, switch off the engine, put off the lights, open the doors, and say, listen. And I have a deep belief in the presence of wonder. You can't manufacture wonder, but you can point towards it and create windows in it for the lives of people. I think beauty does that, nature does that, human contact can do it, prayer can do it, learning can do it. And I think we seek each other on that level as a community, as well as on social levels. And I think people know that. Sometimes when you come into the synagogue, you sense that there is an energy there. And I've sensed that people sense that, whether they are very engaged in their Judaism or not. It's terribly important to foster that. I would also say that I think it takes discipline. That the person who comes very occasionally and says, I looked for God and I didn't find it, that's not really looking. That's not really seeking. And a serious faith, like a serious art, asks for serious time. One of my favourite stories, again which I've told before, I'll finish on this, concerns the story of the priest and the old man and the church in Wales, where the old man is always there, and eventually the priest goes up to him and says, "What brings you?" He's sitting at the back of the church. And he says to him, "Are you talking to God?" And he says, "No." And he says, "Is God talking to you?" And he says, "No." He says, "Well, what are you doing here?" He says, "You know, God and I, we listen to each other. But if you want to listen to someone, you've got to make time. And you've got to make stillness." And I think actually a lot of Jewish law could be framed in creating the space to enable the listening.
Surprised that somebody who has delivered, by my rough estimate, 1,700 sermons knows exactly the right note on which to end. I think the only thing I want to do, and I'm sure all you want to do too, is to say, not only for sharing with us so many thoughts and insights tonight, but for everything you've done for this community over more than 3 decades, to Rabbi Jonathan Wittenberg, thank you.